Here are your vouchers. Everything is accounted for.
Are you sure this is correct?
August 1945. A soft haze clings to the rice paddies of rural Honshu. The sun rises over low wooden houses, illuminating dust that drifts across narrow dirt roads. Smoke from distant fires mingles with the earthy scent of freshly tilled fields. Farmers, weary from months of rationing and endless labor, pause in their morning work as an unfamiliar rumble grows in the distance. American trucks appear over the hill, their engines breaking the usual silence. Soldiers, armed but orderly, step down onto the soil, their boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. Hands gesture, papers are unfurled, and then, something unexpected, they place coins and notes into the farmer's trembling hands. Shock spreads across weathered faces. Money for food taken, for rice, vegetables, supplies that were once seized, often without question, now being offered willingly. The village watches silently, disbelief giving way to cautious curiosity. Trust, fragile and foreign, begins to thread itself through the tense morning. Somewhere in that quiet exchange lies the beginning of a different war, one fought not with guns, but with ethics, culture, and the human cost of occupation. This moment, small yet profound, sets the stage for a clash not of armies, but of values. The story of these interactions begins with a backdrop of devastation, scarcity, and a world still in flames. By mid-1945, Japan's countryside was a shadow of its former self. 4 years of total war had drained the nation's resources, leaving fields untended, granaries empty, and farmers scraping for every grain of rice. Food shortages were widespread, and malnutrition was a daily reality. The island nation had endured relentless bombing campaigns, and the once bustling villages now bore the scars of air raids and collapsed infrastructure. Yet, in these remote regions, life continued in its slow, stubborn rhythm. Farmers rose before dawn, tended to their crops, and carried out chores that seemed almost ceremonial in their persistence. The Japanese economy, already strained by years of military expansion, had shifted entirely towards supporting the war effort. Agricultural policies prioritized cities and military units, leaving rural communities to survive on meager rations. Black markets had flourished, but they were risky and heavily policed. Farmers often faced impossible choices, whether to sell portions of their crops secretly, barter with neighbors, or simply go hungry. Hunger was universal, but so too was pride and the expectation of resilience. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the United States had been advancing steadily toward the Japanese home islands. From the bloody battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, American commanders had learned the importance of logistics and occupation planning. The military supply chain was now extensive, designed not only to sustain troops in hostile environments, but also to stabilize regions after capture. Supplies, food, fuel, and equipment were meticulously organized. Yet, the real challenge lay not in shipping these resources, but in distributing them once the fighting stopped. The approach of U.S. forces into Japan was unprecedented. Unlike previous campaigns in the Pacific, where islands were seized and abandoned or heavily bombed, Japan's home islands presented an entirely new scenario. Occupation, not conquest. Commanders faced a delicate balance. They had to secure resources for troops, maintain order, and avoid alienating civilians who had, until weeks earlier, been considered the enemy. Every decision, every interaction carried weight. A misstep could spark unrest, resistance, or worse, deep resentment that would hinder long-term stabilization. Rural farmers, in particular, were caught in a paradoxical situation. On one hand, They had lived under a regime that demanded sacrifice, obedience, and contribution to the war effort, often under the threat of force. On the other, these same fields and barns now became points of negotiation with foreign soldiers who operated under a vastly different moral and cultural framework. The Japanese concept of honor, loyalty to community, and the inviolability of personal property clashed with the practical, transactional approach of American troops. The first encounters were tentative. Soldiers arrived with forms and receipts, a methodical system unfamiliar to people accustomed to either forced requisition or black market exchanges. For villagers, the sight of Americans offering payment for rice, vegetables, or livestock was almost inconceivable. Many hesitated, unsure if it was a trick, a prelude to confiscation, or an act of genuine fairness. Children watched from behind sliding doors. Women whispered among themselves, and men squared their shoulders in a mixture of suspicion and reluctant curiosity. Behind the scenes, American planners had anticipated these cultural tensions. Manuals issued to occupation forces stressed the importance of fairness, documentation, and respectful interaction. Troops were instructed to avoid arbitrary confiscation and to record every transaction. Payment was emphasized as both ethical and strategic, ensuring cooperation would reduce conflict, streamline supply chains, and build a framework for future governance. Every coin handed over was part of a broader psychological strategy, proof that the occupiers could act with integrity in a country still simmering with the aftereffects of defeat. Yet even with careful planning, the human element remained unpredictable. Farmers' lives were governed by cycles of planting and harvest, by a rhythm of survival that no manual could fully capture. Each interaction carried a weight far greater than its monetary value. A handshake, a signed receipt, a few coins could represent the difference between hunger and sustenance, trust and fear, resentment and reconciliation. It was in this crucible of scarcity, culture, and military pragmatism that the earliest exchanges between Japanese farmers and U.S. troops took place. Small villages became testing grounds for a new form of occupation, one not dominated by force, but by negotiation, patience, and the sometimes fragile currency of mutual understanding. The first interactions, tentative as they were, laid the foundation for a story of human resilience, ethical warfare, and cultural collision. They also set the stage for the angles through which this extraordinary moment could be examined, from the human and tactical to technological, leadership, and moral perspectives. As U.S. forces moved deeper into Japan in late summer 1945, their presence in rural villages became increasingly regular. Soldiers arrived in convoys of trucks, jeeps, and occasionally amphibious vehicles, carrying supplies that had traversed thousands of miles across the Pacific. Their objective was simple in theory, but complex in practice: secure necessary provisions for the occupation force without triggering hostility among civilians who had endured years of hardship. For Japanese farmers, these visits were unlike anything they had experienced. Wartime requisitions under the Imperial Army were often abrupt and uncompromising. Rice, vegetables, and livestock could be taken with minimal explanation or compensation. Now, American troops approached fields with ledgers and receipts. Each farmer was asked to itemize their produce, and each transaction was carefully recorded. The formality itself was striking. Farmers, used to either surrendering goods under duress or negotiating quietly on the black market, were confronted with a methodical system that treated them as partners rather than subordinates. Cultural differences heightened the tension. In Japanese society, property and honor were closely intertwined. The notion that strangers, particularly former enemies, would request goods and then insist on paying for them challenged deeply ingrained norms. Some villagers hesitated, unwilling to accept money for what they believed might be considered stolen or coerced. Others, driven by hunger and practical necessity, reluctantly complied. These initial encounters often involved long periods of negotiation, careful explanation, and sometimes gestures of reassurance, small smiles, nods, or the simple act of handing over coins carefully counted and placed on a table. The American approach was informed by prior experience in occupied territories. Officers understood that a heavy-handed policy could provoke resistance, slow operations, and leave a lasting mark on public perception. Orders emphasized patience, transparency, and respect for local customs, even when such customs were unfamiliar or inconvenient to the military chain of command. The troops were trained to balance authority with fairness, an unusual combination in the chaos of post-war occupation. On a practical level, the U.S. military faced logistical challenges that made these interactions necessary. Supply lines were extensive but fragile. Food sent from supply depots had to be rationed carefully, particularly as forces were dispersed across thousands of square miles of unfamiliar terrain. Purchasing local produce was often faster and more efficient than transporting it from distant ports. Payment for goods was a pragmatic solution, but it also carried symbolic weight. It signaled respect for civilians and helped prevent the erosion of trust. Reports from the field reveal a mixture of amazement and cautious optimism among Japanese farmers. One observer noted in August 1945, the villagers could hardly believe that soldiers of the enemy would pay for what they took. Some counted the coins twice, thinking it a trick, but slowly, smiles began to appear. Children, peeking from behind sliding doors, observed their parents' hesitation and eventual acceptance. The psychological impact was subtle but profound, a bridge between fear and cooperation, suspicion and understanding. These early exchanges were not uniform across Japan. In some areas, farmers remained wary, while in others, transactions proceeded smoothly. Local conditions, crop yields, prior interactions with Japanese military units, and proximity to larger towns played a role in shaping attitudes. Yet the underlying principle remained consistent. The U.S. occupation force sought to procure essential goods through payment rather than force, marking a clear departure from past wartime practices. By the end of these initial encounters, a new rhythm had begun to emerge. Soldiers and villagers alike learned to navigate the delicate balance between necessity and ethics, authority and respect. What might have been a simple logistical operation became an unspoken experiment in cultural diplomacy. The seeds of trust, once planted, allowed for a gradual expansion of similar policies throughout other occupied regions, setting the stage for broader consequences that would ripple through the countryside. These developments now invite a closer examination through multiple perspectives, angles that illuminate not just the practicalities of occupation, but the human, tactical, technological, leadership, and ethical dimensions of this remarkable chapter in history. For the farmers of Honshu, these encounters were more than logistical transactions. They were moments charged with emotion. Years of scarcity, fear, and uncertainty had hardened communities, and the arrival of uniformed soldiers initially sparked anxiety. Hands that had sowed and harvested rice for decades now trembled as coins were placed before them. Some villagers hesitated, staring at the unfamiliar currency, their minds struggling to reconcile the fact that these were former enemies paying for what had once been forcibly taken. The emotional spectrum was broad. Relief mixed with disbelief. Gratitude jostled with mistrust. Mothers shielded their children from the initial exchanges, unsure whether cooperation would bring safety or danger. Elders, rooted in a lifetime of cultural norms and wartime discipline, questioned the morality of accepting payment for goods they had labored to produce. Yet over time, small acts, a soldier bowing slightly in respect, a signed receipt confirming the transaction, began to ease tension. This human element was at the core of the occupation's unexpected success. By engaging directly with civilians, listening to concerns, and showing transparency, American soldiers transformed a potentially volatile situation into one of cooperation. Trust, once thought impossible between conqueror and conquered, began to take root. From a military standpoint, procuring food in occupied territories was a matter of survival and efficiency. Troops stationed in rural Japan were spread thin across villages, and supply lines from ports like Yokohama and Kure were both vulnerable and slow. By paying local farmers for produce, the U.S. Army effectively reduced logistical strain, minimized waste, and avoided the chaos that often followed unregulated requisitions. Strategically, these transactions also served as a stabilizing force. Peaceful interactions with civilians lessened the likelihood of sabotage, theft, or passive resistance. Each paid exchange created a micro-level security network. Villagers became invested in the occupation's success, reporting disturbances and cooperating with troop movements. Commanders understood that controlling territory was not solely about the presence of armed forces. It required winning hearts, or at least mitigating hostility. Moreover, the tactical approach extended beyond mere food acquisition. These carefully managed interactions allowed the military to map villages, assess population morale, and monitor economic activity. Every transaction was both logistical and intelligence-driven, reinforcing the dual role of occupation forces as providers and enforcers. Technology, often overlooked in narratives of rural occupation, played a subtle but crucial role. Trucks and jeeps transported goods across uneven terrain, while portable typewriters and ledger books ensured each transaction was documented. These tools allowed soldiers to standardize payment, prevent disputes, and maintain accountability, a stark contrast to the informal, often coercive practices of prior requisitions. Even communication tools mattered. Translators, field radios, and pre-printed forms enabled soldiers to explain procedures, answer questions, and record transactions accurately. For villagers unfamiliar with written contracts, this combination of technology and protocol conveyed legitimacy. The tangible presence of order, facilitated by relatively simple machines, transformed what could have been chaotic interactions into structured, predictable events. Technological efficiency, paired with cultural sensitivity, reinforced the broader strategy: procurement through payment rather than force. Every ledger entry, every truckload of rice delivered to the base, was a testament to the integration of military logistics and human diplomacy. The success of this unconventional occupation strategy hinged on decisions made at the top. American commanders understood that occupying Japan required more than military might. It demanded foresight, cultural sensitivity, and ethical judgment. Leaders such as General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, emphasized respect for Japanese civilians and the careful administration of resources. Orders were clear. Soldiers were to procure food through payment whenever possible, avoid unnecessary confrontation, and maintain detailed records. This approach represented a deliberate shift from traditional wartime practices, reflecting an understanding that post-war stability relied on goodwill as much as authority. Commanders communicated the rationale to troops. Treating civilians fairly would reduce friction, improve logistical efficiency, and leave a lasting positive impression. Leadership extended to small unit officers in the villages. Captains and lieutenants became intermediaries, interpreting high-level directives while managing interactions with farmers. Their decisions on the ground, how to explain payments, negotiate amounts, and handle suspicion, were critical. A single misstep could spark distrust, undoing careful planning and potentially destabilizing entire regions. From the perspective of the Japanese people, these American soldiers were not just strangers. They were former enemies who had inflicted tremendous suffering through bombing campaigns and forced conscription. Accepting payment from them required a mental recalibration. Many villagers were conditioned to expect coercion, not fairness. The shift in behavior, paying for goods rather than seizing them, was unprecedented. Farmers often expressed disbelief. Some counted the coins repeatedly, certain that the soldiers were attempting a trick. Others hesitated, unsure whether accepting payment would compromise their honor or social standing. This cautious engagement was a delicate dance, with both sides learning to navigate mutual wariness. For Japanese soldiers and former military officials, the approach was equally foreign. Reports indicate that some questioned whether such tactics reflected weakness or strategy. Yet over time, even hardened veterans acknowledged the pragmatism of the method. Fostering cooperation reduced resistance and minimized unnecessary conflict, creating a smoother transition during the occupation. Perhaps the most remarkable dimension of these interactions was their ethical foundation. In a war defined by coercion, deprivation, and brutal occupation policies, the decision to pay for requisition goods represented a conscious choice to act morally. It was a rare acknowledgement that civilians, even in enemy territory, retained rights and dignity. The payments were small in monetary terms, but enormous symbolically. They conveyed respect, fairness, and acknowledgement of the farmer's labor and suffering. Ethical considerations extended beyond the immediate transaction. Soldiers were instructed to treat villagers with courtesy, avoid intimidation, and document exchanges meticulously. These principles not only facilitated smoother operations, but also set a precedent for humane conduct in occupied territories. Historians later emphasized the significance of this ethical approach. By combining respect for human dignity with operational necessity, the occupation established a template that influenced future military engagements, demonstrating that ethical behavior could coexist with strategic objectives. October 1945. The rice harvest in a small village near the Kiso River was ready, golden stalks swaying under a crisp autumn breeze. For generations, this community had measured time by planting and harvest, by seasons and prayers to the earth. But now, the rhythms of daily life were interrupted by the steady rumble of American trucks approaching along narrow dirt roads. The soldiers arrived in formation, led by Lieutenant James Parker, a veteran of the Okinawa campaign. In his hands, he carried ledger books and official orders, meticulously prepared to guide the interactions. The villagers, lined along the edges of their fields, watched cautiously. Elder men, their faces carved by decades of labor, exchanged glances. Women clutched infants close to their chests. Suspicion was thick in the air, but curiosity held them rooted to the spot. Lieutenant Parker spoke through a translator, explaining that the rice, vegetables, and any livestock offered would be purchased at fair rates. Paper receipts were handed to farmers, and coins were counted aloud, one by one, to ensure transparency. Some villagers recoiled at the suggestion, mistrust evident in the tightening of fists and furrowed brows. Others stepped forward hesitantly, lured by the promise of food, medicine, or essential goods that the occupation forces could provide. The first transaction set the tone. A middle-aged farmer, Takashi Ito presented a small bundle of rice. Parker carefully weighed the grain, recorded the details, and handed over the agreed payment. Ito counted the coins repeatedly, his hands shaking, eyes darting from the money to the soldiers. Relief, confusion, and disbelief intertwined on his face. Around him, neighbors whispered, watched, and gradually followed suit. The scene was tense, yet strangely ritualistic. Each exchange reinforced an emerging pattern. American authority exercised with fairness, Japanese labor acknowledged with respect. Soldiers moved from family to family, jotting down quantities, weighing produce, and ensuring that each transaction was properly documented. Children, previously hiding, began to peek from behind sliding doors, their curiosity overcoming fear. As the day progressed, logistical challenges arose. Trucks were loaded carefully, ensuring no damage to fragile sacks of rice. Soldiers coordinated with one another to prevent bottlenecks or miscalculations. Meanwhile, villagers began to adapt, forming orderly lines and assisting in moving produce. What began as a tentative interaction had transformed into a structured, almost ceremonial process. Yet beneath the surface, tension lingered. Some villagers still questioned the soldiers' motives. Others worried that accepting money would bring shame or violate cultural norms. Small incidents, a miscounted sack, a nervous gesture, tested patience and diplomacy. Lieutenant Parker and his team responded with calm efficiency, clarifying, explaining, and, when necessary, demonstrating how the system ensured fairness for both sides. By late afternoon, the majority of the harvest had been procured. The village, initially wary, had participated fully in the process. Trust, though fragile, had begun to take root. For the American troops, the operation validated months of careful planning. Payment, transparency, and cultural sensitivity had transformed a potentially contentious scenario into a cooperative effort. The climax of the day was not marked by a single dramatic event, but by the cumulative effect of hundreds of small, precise interactions. Each coin exchanged, each receipt signed, each sack of rice loaded onto a truck represented a minor victory in building a bridge between conqueror and conquered. The villagers began to see the soldiers not as invaders, but as pragmatic actors navigating the complexities of occupation. And yet, even as cooperation spread, underlying cultural and emotional currents remained. Suspicion, honor, and pride were not eradicated in a single day. They would continue to influence interactions across Japan. The events in this small village became a microcosm of a larger turning point in occupation strategy, one where human understanding, ethical conduct, and careful planning reshaped the nature of post-war engagement. The outcomes of these first large-scale exchanges now set the stage for the second phase of the climax. The deeper implications, broader acceptance, and long-term consequences of this unprecedented approach to occupation. In the weeks following the initial harvest transactions, the impact of the U.S. occupation policy spread to neighboring villages along the Kiso River and beyond. Word traveled quickly. American soldiers did not simply take what they needed, they offered payment. This revelation challenged the expectations of countless rural communities, where years of deprivation had taught that resources were scarce, that every encounter with authority carried risk. In one village near Nagano, farmers approached the soldiers with cautious optimism. A young man named Hiroshi Nakamura brought his family's small herd of goats, unsure whether the offer of money was genuine. He watched as coins changed hands, receipts were signed, and soldiers bowed respectfully. The ritualized exchange, repeated over dozens of households, created a pattern. Predictability and fairness replaced fear and suspicion. Children followed their parents, observing not just the act of payment, but the conduct of the soldiers, internalizing a new social script, one where interaction could be transactional, yet dignified. For the American troops, the broader significance was becoming clear. These were not isolated successes. They represented a scalable method for resource acquisition, local stability, and community engagement. Supply chains could be supplemented efficiently without provoking resistance, and morale among troops improved when they witnessed that their conduct fostered cooperation rather than resentment. Commanders noted in reports that villages previously hostile or wary were now actively assisting with logistics, offering guidance on local terrain, storage, and harvest schedules. Yet the turning point extended beyond logistics. A subtle shift occurred in perception on both sides. Farmers, initially hesitant, began to see the Americans not solely as conquerors, but as pragmatic partners in a fragile post-war ecosystem. Soldiers, in turn, recognized that ethical conduct, payment, transparency, respect for local customs, was not merely a moral choice, but a practical strategy that enhanced operational efficiency. Leadership and field-level execution converged to create a model of occupation that relied as much on human psychology as on military authority. Cultural nuances continue to play a role. In some regions, villagers insisted on presenting goods in a ceremonial manner, reflecting the Japanese sense of propriety and honor. Soldiers adapted, adjusting their procedures to accommodate these customs, further cementing trust. In mountainous regions where transport was difficult, cooperation ensured that supply lines remained intact, reducing the need for heavy-handed enforcement. The fusion of ethics, logistics, and cultural awareness created a turning point that fundamentally altered the relationship between occupiers and the occupied. By late October, reports from multiple districts noted a remarkable phenomenon. Villages that had once viewed soldiers with fear now anticipated their arrival, often preparing goods in advance and offering assistance. Payments were documented meticulously, yet the symbolic value extended far beyond accounting. Coins and notes were small gestures compared to the larger psychological impact. Trust had been earned, mutual respect established, and a foundation laid for broader societal reconstruction. Even the former Japanese military acknowledged the unusual nature of the occupation. In field diaries and post-war interviews, officers noted that American conduct was unexpectedly principled. While some initially considered it a sign of weakness, others recognized the strategic brilliance. A pacified population required fewer troops, fewer conflicts, and allowed for smoother post-war governance. The turning point, therefore, was both tactical and moral, a convergence rarely seen in modern warfare. By late 1945, the results of the U.S. occupation strategy were becoming clear in rural Japan. Villages that had experienced the first paid transactions for food reported a notable decrease in tension between civilians and soldiers. Harvests were procured efficiently, and essential goods reached American troops without the disruption or resentment that had characterized earlier wartime requisitions. The careful balance of respect, transparency, and documentation had translated into operational success, demonstrating that ethical conduct could coexist with military objectives. For farmers, the immediate outcomes were tangible. Families who had faced months of scarcity found themselves with coins to purchase rice, vegetables, and other necessities previously out of reach. In many villages, elders expressed astonishment and cautious relief. Some kept detailed notes of the exchanges, recording both quantities and payments as a precaution, a reflection of both practicality and lingering suspicion. Children observed the process, internalizing lessons about fairness, trust, and the unexpected behavior of former enemies. American troops, in turn, found that the policy reduced logistical strain and minimized conflict. Field reports from October 1945 highlight the efficiency gains. Convoys moved more smoothly, Fewer troops were required to oversee procurement, and villages became active participants in sustaining the occupation. One report from the 5th Infantry Division stated, "Villagers are now assisting in loading and preparing supplies for transport. Compliance is voluntary, but consistent. Morale among the troops is higher due to the cooperative environment." This cooperative model also had psychological consequences. The act of paying for food, while modest in monetary terms, carried immense symbolic weight. Farmers began to see the Americans not merely as occupiers, but as actors governed by rules and fairness, a stark contrast to previous experiences under both the Imperial Army and earlier enemy forces. Trust, still fragile, had begun to form the foundation of a new relationship. However, challenges remained. Not all villages immediately embraced the system. In more remote regions, suspicion lingered, and occasional disputes over weights, payment amounts, or misunderstandings of procedure required careful intervention by officers. The meticulous documentation process proved essential, preventing small issues from escalating into larger conflicts. These incidents reinforced the importance of training, communication, and cultural sensitivity as integral components of occupation strategy. At the national level, the success of these early interactions informed broader policy decisions. Commanders noted that villages participating in pay transactions required fewer troops for monitoring and enforcement, allowing forces to be redeployed to regions with more complex logistical or security challenges. Reports emphasized that the ethical, transparent approach not only reduced resistance, but also enhanced long-term stability, a dual benefit that reinforced the occupation's objectives. The tangible outcomes were mirrored by subtler social shifts. Villagers who participated in transactions gained a sense of agency within a transformed hierarchy. The knowledge that labor would be compensated, even by former enemies, contributed to a recalibration of expectations and trust. Communities began to develop informal routines for interacting with soldiers, preparing harvests in ways that streamlined transactions and minimized confusion. The occupation, once a source of fear, became a structured, if uneasy, partnership. As October turned into November, the cumulative effect of these interactions became evident. Villages that had experienced early cooperation reported smoother harvest management, increased morale, and fewer misunderstandings with troops. American soldiers, for their part, gained a sense of confidence in the occupation system. Ethical conduct, strategic foresight, and careful planning had proven effective in a real-world context, bridging the gap between military necessity and human decency. These immediate results laid the groundwork for broader consequences, both practical and cultural, that would unfold in the months and years following the initial occupation. The stage was set to examine the long-term outcomes of this approach, revealing not just operational efficiency, but the profound social and moral implications of paying for what was once forcibly taken. As winter approached in late 1945, the broader implications of the U.S. occupation strategy became increasingly evident across rural Japan. Villages that had initially met soldiers with suspicion now actively anticipated their visits. The concept of payment for requisition goods, once shocking, had begun to normalize, fostering a sense of order and predictability in communities accustomed to chaos and deprivation. Farmers prepared harvests methodically, offering goods with receipts and expecting fair compensation. Beyond the immediate logistical benefits, the approach had a lasting psychological impact. Trust, once fragile, had become a tool of governance. Villagers recognized that ethical behavior on the part of the occupiers created reciprocal stability. Some local leaders recorded the exchanges meticulously, creating informal village ledgers that documented both produce and payment. These records were not mandated, but the habit reflected an emerging confidence that cooperation, rather than resistance, offered security and material benefit. The policy also influenced social dynamics within the villages. Families discussed how to interact with soldiers, negotiated internally about which goods to offer, and educated children on appropriate conduct during transactions. Traditional notions of honor and pride were gradually reconciled with the practical realities of occupation. Acceptance of payment did not necessarily erode dignity. Instead, it created a new framework in which survival, fairness, and respect could coexist. For the American military, the long-term operational advantages were clear. Troop deployment became more efficient as fewer personnel were needed to oversee procurement. Supply chains stabilized, and intelligence gathered through repeated village interactions proved invaluable. Commanders reported that the system reduced friction, minimized theft, and encouraged voluntary cooperation, all while reinforcing the moral credibility of U.S. forces in the eyes of civilians. Historians later emphasized the broader significance of these policies. In regions where payments were consistently made and interactions remained respectful, post-war reconstruction proceeded more smoothly. Villages that had engaged with troops through structured exchanges were better positioned to integrate with national relief efforts, receive additional aid, and participate in rebuilding initiatives. Conversely, areas where payment systems were inconsistently applied experienced more tension, highlighting the importance of transparency and fairness as guiding principles. The ethical and practical dimensions of this strategy left a lasting imprint on both communities and the occupation forces. Japanese civilians remembered the small coins and receipts not merely as transactions, but as symbols of unexpected fairness and human decency. Soldiers, many of whom had witnessed the horrors of combat and occupation elsewhere, noted the profound difference that respect and ethical behavior made in maintaining order and fostering cooperation. This chapter of post-war history demonstrates that even small gestures, coins exchanged for rice, careful documentation, and courteous conduct, can have outsized effects in shaping human behavior and social stability. The occupation of rural Japan through ethical procurement became a quiet yet powerful example of how military policy, cultural sensitivity, and moral choice intersected to produce lasting outcomes. The story of Japanese farmers and U.S. soldiers exchanging rice for coins is, at first glance, a small episode in the vast panorama of World War II. Yet within this seemingly modest interaction lies a profound lesson about human behavior, ethics, and the mechanics of war. In a conflict defined by scarcity, violence, and fear, the act of paying for what was needed, rather than seizing it by force, transformed both communities and occupiers. For the farmers, it was more than food or money. It was recognition of their labor, an affirmation of dignity, and a glimpse of a world in which fairness could exist even in the shadow of defeat. Generations raised on strict codes of honor and loyalty saw that their work mattered, that their efforts were acknowledged, and that survival need not come at the cost of principle. The coins and receipts became symbols of trust, the first fragile threads weaving a new social fabric in the aftermath of war. For the American troops, the experience reinforced a vital truth. Ethical conduct is not a hindrance to military efficiency. It is an instrument of strategy. Treating civilians with respect, documenting interactions, and adhering to principles of fairness produce cooperation, reduce conflict, and enhance logistical effectiveness. Leadership, planning, and cultural sensitivity converge to create a model of occupation where humanity and pragmatism were inseparable. Historically, these interactions offer a lens through which to understand the broader occupation of Japan. They reveal how ethics, culture, and operational necessity intersected to reshape relationships between former enemies. They remind us that even in the aftermath of devastation, small gestures, coins, words, acts of respect can ripple through communities, fostering trust, stability, and hope. Ultimately, the story is both practical and philosophical. It is a testament to the power of human decency in the machinery of war, and to the ways in which understanding, respect, and careful planning can alter the course of history. In the quiet villages of Honshu, amidst rice fields and dusty roads, a simple act of payment became a turning point, not just in occupation strategy, but in the way war itself could acknowledge the dignity of those caught in its wake. This was a war fought not only on battlefields, but also in moments of human connection, where courage and conscience quietly shaped the world to come.